all for being here. My name is Livonia Monte. I've met many of you, but for those I have not, I'm the program manager for the Massachusetts Institute for College and Career Readiness, MICCR, and what we're doing today is a senior research forum focused on mixed methods. And so we have one of our presenters, Principal Investigator Scott Solberg, who will introduce our presenters for today.
All right. Well, thank you, Livonia. So we're one of the topics that has come up probably for the last few months around the MICCR work is how do we get involved in mixed methods research? And we're fortunate at Boston University that we have Michelle Porche, who's been working a lot with Renee Spencer. Both are, as a team, great at conducting the mixed methods methodology. So Michelle is in applied human development, and Renee is in social work. Renee also teaches the qualitative classes that we encourage all of our doctoral students to take because it's just an exceptional course. So we're really looking forward to the conversation today, and given that we're starting a few minutes late, I'm just going to go ahead and let you both get started. We're going to spend about 25 minutes or so on the PowerPoint, and then we'll go to discussion. Certainly use the chat box, though. If there's questions that come up, we don't want to lose anyone. And if we need to pause to get some clarification, we can. So otherwise, just make sure everything's on mute if you're not speaking, and we'll go forward. So thank you, Michelle and Renee.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Let me see. Now, do I get to move the slides forward?
You do, Michelle.
Okay, here we go. Yep,
great
work. Okay. So, yeah, Renee and I have been working, we've had a history of working together, and we're hoping to, do more work together in the future. But, we had sent out a couple examples of papers. One is, one of the first mixed methods papers that Renee and I had published looking at gender equity in middle school. And then also one on kids' aspirations, high school students' aspirations for STEM that I published recently, and that's the example we'll talk about, but we can answer questions about any of them. And, we're just going to give an overview of mixed methods, give this example, and then we'll have time to talk about particular questions that people have. And, again, we just look back to John Cresswell has a very important resource for understanding methods, and especially for understanding mixed methods. And I think, let me see what we go next. Renee, I'll let you start to pick this up.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to back up. Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to back up here to John Cresswell's quote, kind of his definition of mixed methods, and maybe to offer a little framing for this too. I've been doing some remodeling in our house over the past year. We've had a couple of epiphanies that resulted from that, and one is, many of you may have one of these, a refrigerator where the refrigerator part is on the top and the freezer is on the bottom. If you haven't had this experience, it's like an aha experience, like why didn't we do that a long time ago? It makes so much sense. And I was thinking about it, and it's kind of this holdover from a time when there were ice boxes, right, where literally you'd put the block of ice at the top of the fridge and you'd put the contents that you were trying to refrigerate below. That morphed into refrigerator freezers where the freezers were on top and the fridges were on the bottom. And now over time, we figured out, hey, it makes a whole lot more sense to have the refrigerator, which are going into and out of all of the time, on the top instead of on the bottom. So this is sort of a silly analogy or a way of just sort of saying, when you I think what we're coming to in the social sciences with mixed methods is this much more pragmatic approach that makes so much sense. But because of kind of our history and holdover and ways that we thought about research and what research is and is not, it's kind of gotten in the way of us using some very pragmatic approaches to research. So mixed methods kind of brings us all back around and basically says, look, there are these multiple ways to answer research questions. And some of our questions call for quantitative approaches, and some of our questions call for qualitative approaches, and some of them actually require both. And so mixed methods is a way to sort of bring all of that together, and for us to not feel like our hands are tied or there's some form of data that we can't use or windows into the human experience that somehow we can't access or aren't as valued or valuable as others. So I really am excited to see this interest in mixed methods really taking off. It just makes so much more sense. But we do have a history in the social sciences of how we've thought about research, and shifting over and really thinking about mixed methods has led to a lot of conversation, and mixed methods have gotten called a lot of different things. So you hear a lot of terms bandied about. These are just some examples, and some people are parsing these in very specific ways, but really, you know, this comes down to thinking about both words and numbers and stories and counting, all of these things as mattering and being approaches that we can use to try to answer our research questions and get us closer to the kind of understanding we need to design effective approaches. I do research in the field of youth mentoring, so I'm always thinking about the program implications and the practical applications, and education, you know, which is part of my background, and you know, we're living in that world as well. So is what's going to make a difference for young people in getting the better outcomes. Some of the reasons for using mixed methods, again, these pragmatic approaches, that sometimes you just need different or multiple perspectives to get a complete understanding of something. You want to understand associations, but you also want to understand processes and mechanisms. I'm involved in a project right now. We've got a mixed method study, actually IES funded, where we're developing a model for school-based mentoring for military-connected youth. And we've got a pilot test of the program running right now this year. But next month, we'll be going in and interviewing, in addition to the pre-post surveys, we'll be going in and interviewing the different stakeholders. So the student mentees, the mentors, the teachers, the school counselors, the parents, kind of all of the people who have had to, you know, touch this intervention or maybe have been impacted by it, because this is a new approach. And we both want to understand, you know, does it make a difference for kids? Those are those important outcome questions. But maybe there are ways it makes a difference that we didn't predict or didn't anticipate. And so talking to these different stakeholders can give us a better understanding. Or if we see these outcomes, how were those outcomes achieved? And again, by talking to these different participants, it might give us a better understanding of the processes at work in these mentoring relationships. Then these other reasons, I won't go over each of them. We're going to make sure, again, there's time to talk about the example and lots of time for questions. But, you know, you're trying to build a hypothesis. Maybe you're not completely there. You don't have all the details ironed out, so you've got to go in and do some exploratory work to do hypothesis building first. Maybe you've got some really interesting quantitative results and you want to try to explain them. And, you know, we're often left, if we just have those, you know, what predicts what, or the associations and the correlations, which, again, are incredibly important. It allows us to look across a larger population and make some discernments about that. But then we're left to our own devices to to kind of paint the picture. You go in there and get those qualitative findings as well, you can paint a richer picture of what's really happening. And Michelle and I have done some work like that as well. That's part of the example today, you'll see.
Right.
And I've used, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, and Renee and I have worked on instrument development. We have a few important gender ideology scales where we did a lot of focus group and interviews and individual interviews to really start to develop a pool of items that we were able to winnow down into some scales that are pretty widely used.
Yeah, I got some great input from the young people, the end users, the people, right, that we were going to be taking this instrument. So Michelle ran a bunch of pilot tests and focus groups with those young people, and again, developed, we think, a much stronger instrument as a consequence of that. You know, and you see these other examples. So it's, you know, again, when you need kind of a fuller picture or one kind of data, it won't tell the whole story. Then these are the times to turn to mixed methods to help you out. The other kinds of reasons are, you know, sometimes it's a validity question that you feel like the quantitative or the qualitative data alone won't do the trick. It's really in the combination that you feel like you're going to be able to have some faith in your results, a reasonable amount of, I think we're, you know, in the right vicinity here with our findings. They can give you greater confidence when you have both kinds of data and bringing both approaches together. Sometimes they can, however, lead you to different conclusions, and that's the second example article that Michelle sent on the gender equity, where the two forms of data paint a somewhat different story, and then you got to figure out, well, what do we think that means, or what to do with that, emerging different story. Sometimes the methods can offset the weaknesses of one another. So again, with the qualitative studies, you've got these little samples, and yes, you've got rich data, but how idiosyncratic, and who does this really generalize to, and what kinds of claims can be made. So you can test that, right? Then you can bring in those great tools that we have at our disposal and get a larger sample and use some measures and try to test the things that you've learned through the qualitative approaches, and vice versa. So kind of offsetting the weaknesses of the different approaches can be a really good reason to use mixed methods. You need a more complete or comprehensive picture, and again, you see these other kinds of examples. Context towards the bottom, that's an important one where you can really sometimes augment your quantitative design with some more qualitative data that can give you those contextual factors that may get lost in, again, trying to in trying to be able to make those broader claims. But then where's the richness or the detail, or bringing the setting to life to understand the context within which those data were collected, or to help you better understand those findings. The last one is utility, and this is really, again, where qualitative methods can shine. Well, one, quantitative, about how effective is something. That's a really important question that we need to know the answer to. Where do we send our dollars, and which approaches make the most difference? On the flip side of that, too, though, is understanding how and why, and sometimes those rich stories can be really helpful to people on the ground trying to implement the different approaches, of getting a sense of how it really works. And I'd liken it to when I was in my olden days as a practicing social worker. Case studies were always so helpful to me. It's not like I was going to encounter that same client in my own practice, but boy, reading about somebody else making their way through a case helped me think about my cases in new ways. And so it can be very helpful for practitioners to have, again, both of these kinds of data in the field. You all are experienced researchers, you know about these different kinds of approaches, but just reminders of the kind of data that can be collected using these different methods. And one of the things that we haven't really addressed that can arise is different paradigms. So when you look in the qualitative side of things, like narrative analysis, where sometimes there's a whole set of assumptions that can feel quite antithetical to the more kind of post-positivistic ideas of inter-rater reliability and bias and these kinds of things. So, while on the one hand I say it's great and there are these ways you can do these approaches together and they're so helpful and useful, there are also ways in which sometimes they can clash, and working in teams can sometimes help you maximize the strengths of these different approaches while also trying to figure out how to reckon with some of the different viewpoints or the different traditions that they represent. And people may have questions about that, and we can talk some about that in real terms. My resource online, and since you all have access to these slides, you can find it if you just Google this, NIH Best Practice Guidelines, Creswell 2011, you'll get this. And it's really talking about how to write and review grant proposals using a mixed method approach, and the kinds of things you really have to focus on. One of the challenges for mixed methods is, well, then you've got to make an argument for this, and an argument for each approach and why you need the different forms of data collection. It might be you have two related research questions, and each of those questions require a different approach. Or you might have one overarching question, and to really get at that question, you've got to do these multiple forms of data collection. Whatever the approach, whatever the design, you do have to argue for these different kinds of approaches, and it does make it more complicated. And this is one of the places that people can get into trouble, where they pay a lot of attention to one side or the other of these approaches and forget you've really got to, provide that clear rationale, just like you do for both. Don't pay so much attention to quant and forget the qual, or vice versa.
So let's, I know, we're gonna get tight on time, but let's.
You go ahead.
So I'm gonna jump in. and then you can go back over these slides at your own leisure. Yeah. But thinking about convergent design, how do our results support each other, explanatory, maybe I'm doing one sequentially so I can begin to think about explaining the other one. So and often I'll use qualitative data to explain qualitative results, or just exploratory, what ways do these generalize one to the other. And I think the main thing you think about more in a planning stage is it going to be simultaneous or sequential? And the example I'm going to give is sequential design, where we start with quantitative and then we go to qualitative to better understand results. And again, these are just different visual ways of thinking about how you integrate your interpretation once you have your results. And I think this is the big takeaway, that you don't have the quantitative and qualitative results so separate from each other. You really think about how to integrate them. Okay, so I want to get to the example. I think we've kind of gone over why this is valuable. So what I want to talk about is quickly is a study that I did. This is an NSF-funded study to look at what are the barriers for urban adolescents retention in STEM classes in high school and aspirations for STEM college, so careers in STEM as they go through. And this was funded by NIH because they wanted to address barriers specifically for girls and women, and also for underrepresented minority boys. So we had a quantitative survey in 5 large high schools in a large urban district, and then we followed those up with some qualitative interviews to really understand what were the barriers for students remaining interested and engaged in STEM. And we used grounded theory in our coding to understand these things. And so, but let me go to how we did the sampling. We collected survey data from over 1,000 high school students. But we wanted to go back and figure out, we wanted to talk to a subgroup of those students. This is by the way, very expensive study, and it took 3 years, and it was an incredible amount of work. So for people who do a lot of quantitative work, 53 doesn't sound like a lot, but for people who do qualitative, no, that's a very large qualitative interview sample. So we looked at their survey data, and we wanted to be selective in who we interviewed because we wanted to represent a range of interest, a range of ability, diversity by race, ethnicity, and gender, and also we were in 5 schools, so we wanted to have representatives from each of the 5 schools. But what I really did for the sampling, which did sample across those different areas, was to have kids who were high interest and low ability, and high interest, high ability, and those were really the ones we were most interested in, but also low interest and high ability. Like, why, if they're really good at it, why don't they want to stay in it? And then we just had a few with low interest, low ability. So, we weren't sampling each of those quadrants evenly, but we're looking at where our major interests were. So this is just a quick slide of the schools so you can get a sense of where these kids were from. All of the 5 high schools had either a strong science curriculum or some strong engagement in STEM work. So that's how we narrowed it down. But they also had a range of, how need in terms of poverty level, but also how many of the kids were at risk for dropout or, likelihood of going on to college and so on. So if you look, we first did a logistic regression of our quantitative data, and we found, as you might expect, when we asked, do you feel that there is support for girls and women in science, girls tended to say not as much compared to the boys. And then when we asked, is there support for African American and Latino students in pursuing science, we found that, in fact, African American and Latino students felt there wasn't as much support compared to white students. And then we also had some other issues around some of the schools did not, had some differences in how much support there was. Okay, so which leads us to think, okay, there's something going on here around these, gender and race ethnicity issues. So we came up with a protocol to ask questions about, how are you encouraged? What are some things that might get in the way, and so on. We did those interviews. We did what we call a bucket code of relevant text answering specific questions. We read through those. And when I did that, I started to see, there was some overlap with the work of Daryl Wang Su on racial microaggressions. And, I was really referring to his theoretical framework to think about how to understand, what we were reading in those interviews. So, went through to see, can we do coding, that's aligned with that framework, and also are there other codes that are coming out as well. And we came up, I think there, we had 5 different codes. So the first one, this is an example of micro assaults. So you have an African American Latina student saying, scientists have the power. A lot of people don't like the idea of women having power. So this is how she explained it. And then an African American male student said, he gave an example of his mother not getting a job while she was working in a pharmacy because, they gave like you said, the boss gave the dude a job that she had earned. So these are examples of students seeing discrimination either in the workplace or in their classroom. Micro insults was the second theme we saw. Just this idea of societal beliefs and assumptions that students hear. This Juliet, who's a white student, says, I don't think it's true that a lot of girls are less interested. It's more because of these messages from society. If a girl is told the girls are less interested, then she's likely to be less interested. Or the student Bio 10. By the way, these are the students all picked their code names. She talked about a lot of people look at her and say, because she's a black student, she's not going to succeed. But they also, thinking of this model minority, they look at Chinese students and say, well, they're going to be good in science. So how these assumptions are getting in the way of their ability to remain interested and engaged in STEM. One of the things, so those were a couple examples. Another code that we came up with was we had a lot of students who actually talked about progress. Maybe there aren't any barriers. Maybe there's not discrimination because I'm a girl and I'm doing well. Or people, another student saying there's always going to be someone to discriminate, but, I think it's getting better. So I think that was, some positive messages that students were expressing that we wanted to be able to record. And then some students rejected the whole idea that there were barriers. You just sign up, you get a scholarship. I think things are, it's supportive. Or another student, it's just equal. We do the same amount of work. We get the same guidelines, standards are the same. So again, just getting a sense of what the range of meaning that students were making when they were answering those survey scales. Let me see. I'm going to skip this one. Well, let me go back to it. I think what we were picking up is the perceptions related to whether or not microaggressions existed were aligned with whether girls were talking about gender sorts of microaggressions and whether minority students were talking about microaggressions related to minority issues. And you tended to have white students and boys saying that there are no barriers. So, that's what we found there. Okay, so, just putting these together, as I said, we had this, lower likelihood that girls felt support, and similarly lower likelihood that underrepresented minorities felt that there was support for them in science. And, explained by the way that they felt they were getting these messages in their classrooms and, even outside of the classroom as well. And, we think that this is, these daily experiences the students are coming up against may be, reasons why they lose interest or don't want to go on. We definitely had some students who were in exam schools, that were very hard to get into in our district, and just felt like, they couldn't deal with this, what they felt were a lot of negative messages, and ended up dropping out of those. So, we felt like, overall that the both sets of results really helped us helped an understanding overall, and that they complemented each other. So those are that was the speedy summary, and maybe we can go to questions and specific questions you guys might have about your own studies.
Yeah, that was great, and really exciting, interesting study that really shows why the mixed methods gives you so much more depth as you start to understand the process. So we're open for questions if people want to use the chat box, or if they want to come off of mute and ask a question directly, that would be great. While we're getting there, why don't I get started on this? So when you mentioned the fact that with the qualitative study, and you've got this large sample of 57, it takes a long time, and you're going to have some funding to be able to do that. What are some other strategies that one can use if they don't have that kind of money, just to be able to try to really get to the richness as you described, but doing it within the resources that they have?
I have, one great example. I can't remember. I think it was a study looking at sexual health that some colleagues did. And one of the things they did, they had, pretty standard quantitative scales, but they had some open-ended questions that they were really able to go deeper into, and had a successful published mixed method study, with pretty much simply using the open-ended questions that students answered, and along with the scale answers.
I'll just add too, so in the example that Michelle gave, she had the resources, which is great, and so she was able to do that really robust qualitative component and do the sampling on the 4 quadrants. You could interview 10 kids or 12 students, and you wouldn't be able to do that quadrant, because then you'd end up with 2 kids in each box, but you could do, think about 2 dimensions that you might want to sample on, and do 5 of each, or 6 of each, or it doesn't have to be that sample of 50-something students. Again, really robust. It allowed her to do a lot, but you can also do a lot with a little, and so even taking it down to a more manageable size, and recognizing the limitations then that you may have, stumbled on to some patterns that might or might not play out, at a larger scale. So it'd be much more, you wouldn't be as confident in your findings as Michelle is at the end of the day, but you might have some interesting ideas about next steps or thoughts about where to take things.
Right. And we've got some questions it looks like coming in, but before they finish then. So tell me about how, there's two of you here. So how, if I'm a quantitative researcher, I assume that it's the teamwork that's really important. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that in terms of, Renee, do you find yourself doing both ends of it, or do you find yourself more in collaboration? And Michelle, you seem to be doing both in terms of quantitative and qualitative on your end.
Well, one of the things is probably if Renee and I work together, we can do both, but we probably are a little stronger in one side or the other. And I just think about, working with people who can really complement, where you're strong or where you could be stronger.
Right. Renee, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I think Michelle's stronger in both than I am. I started out trying to do both. Michelle's maintained more of that than I have, and I think I've ended up doing much more of the qualitative side and collaborating with other people. So I work in teams, and my collaborator tends to run the quantitative side of things, and I run the qualitative side of things, and we work together to think about, so that they're not separate domains. We do think about how they work together and integrate those results.
Right.
Michelle's a better example of somebody who really does it all.
Okay. Right.
It's a master of none.
No, that's not
so
true.
There's so there's a question that many
so Ray has a
students,
question.
Yeah. So, how do you go about selecting questions? We usually have that's part of any survey data collection. There's going to be kids who just are not going to answer questions. But, we do try and link it to, our real questions of interest, and we know that we're not going to get a full response rate on that. And we report it in our analysis. So, if we really had low response for an open-ended question, I wouldn't analyze it. I would feel like, there's just too many people skipped it. But if I get a, pretty strong response rate, if 70% of the kids fill that out, I would probably go ahead and really analyze that.
Right. And then Nikki's got some questions about some additional resources, which we could probably take offline, and we can get some and send it out to everyone. So I think that's a great idea, and I know that the Cresswell's certainly been leading on that area. Alonzo, are you on the phone? Did you want to ask a question? I know you raised your hand. I'm not sure how that works, or whether it's through the microphone. Not seeing it. Okay. So thought he had one in there. Now, when you're doing your qualitative end of things, you described in your study these were interviews that you conducted. Is that right?
Yes,
with 53
we did.
Students.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I also had a card sort. There's a lot of different things I did. So the interviews ended up being about 45 minutes. That's why it was so intensive.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, very interesting. And then can you give, while we're waiting, I know a lot of those is typing here in a second, but can you give an example of how you could use qualitative research to verify the impact of an intervention that's going on? I saw you had in one of the slides that kind of concept. Just give an example of how that might go.
And I think of something off the top of my head. Do you have something, Renee?
So I think about it. So you might see. To be sure, you want to see it in outcome data. That's where that's what's going to give you the most confidence. But to understand what that really looks like or sounds like, the qualitative data can be really helpful. So I'm working with a researcher now. She's done this 6-week training for first-generation college students, and it's kind of like how to build connections, build your social networks. And she did a pre-post, and in the post, they got an increased GPA on the people who went through this little 6-session training versus those who didn't. And in the qualitative data, you get some sense of how. So the students say things like, well, I emailed and this professor didn't respond, but this other one did, so I kept after it. I remember them saying in that session that some of the professors will respond and some don't, and you can't get discouraged, so I kept going. So, you know, it gives you the sense of how that might work. Like, how can a little 6-session intervention make a difference? Well, if it's giving students some confidence to persist, well, first of all, to reach out to a professor, to burst that notion that only go to professors when you're in trouble, which the middle-class kids know you go to professors just to make connections and to make contact. So the students described doing that, and then also described, you know, remembering some of the lessons when they didn't always get the response that they wanted. So it gives you some sense of kind of how things work. That's one example I can think of. Or we have quotes from, I think, in mentoring, some of the work that I've done where, you know, kids describe what it's meant to them to have a mentor, which is really different than when you see an increase in a self-esteem score. Like, that's important. You want to see, did the treatment group improve versus the control group? But then hearing a kid say what it meant to them and how that it impacted how they feel about themselves gives you, oh, okay, I see how that works. And I think a richer sense of the impact.
And a stronger story then in describing the power of the intervention.
I think
it also, you know, one of the things that we're struggling with in mentoring is figuring out if we're measuring the right things, you know, so sometimes you get these powerful stories and then you're not seeing it in the outcome data. Well, so like, why isn't the treatment group doing a whole lot better on these outcomes than the control group? Well, maybe we're not measuring the right things, or maybe we're measuring them too soon. Maybe there's a lag effect. Or so when you get these powerful stories juxtaposed, kind of, data that makes you kind of shrug your shoulder and go, well, I don't know, it doesn't sound like it was that great. But boy, these people are telling us that it was really meaningful to them. Then it gets you thinking about, well, again, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring at the right time? Like, how do we square what people are telling us about their experiences in these scores? And you don't really want to choose, I believe, one over the other. It's more like, well, what do we make of the fact that they don't seem to sync up in the way we might imagine them to? And it leads you to new questions, I think.
Right. So so maybe some of the questions. So Laura's had a good question, which really gets down to the tactics. If we're working with high school students, which is what's going on in our study, what are some of the challenges and what are some of the strategies you use to be able to do interviews with students?
Well, I know, you know, one of the main challenges is, you know, getting them to want to participate. But I'll tell, and you asked about getting approval. You know, we know that that's part of our design when we start out. So that's in the original grant proposal. It's in the IRB. We know that we're going to go in and ask them. So what we usually do is when they do their assent, in addition to their parental consent, in their assent, we also say, we're going to do additional interviews. Are you interested? So that's another way we kind of, you know, we have a subset of students who are willing to be interviewed. And I think, again, it was at least 2/3 of the students who agreed to be in the study also agreed to be interviewed in follow-up interviews, and then we go through and invite them. You know, we just make it a comfortable experience. You know, I think, you know, Renee and I have done interviews for many years, and I know Renee is a really skilled interviewer, and, you know, and I think, you know, we try and train whoever we're going to work with to really do a good job with the students, to make them feel listened to know that everything is confidential. And, you know, so I have to say, I have rarely had a bad experience doing an interview. I'd say, like, the only one I had and these were longitudinal interviews, so we interviewed them like twice in this 3-year study period, One of them was just a little reluctant to talk about her parents because I think she was an undocumented immigrant. And once I kind of got the message that she didn't want to say more about that, I backed off.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
So and then there was, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I was just saying, so basically, the IRB process is the IRB process. So you've got to get the parent consent and then the student assent. But what you're really describing is really being open, helping the students know that this is something that might happen. I'm assuming the questions you're asking are relatable to them because it's some experience they've had. So that must also facilitate their interest, except when you get something like an undocumented worker saying, or student, I don't think I want to go down certain discussion lines, which makes sense.
Right. And
Exactly.
Renee and I mean, we've worked on, studies of very personal, sensitive issues, say, around adolescent sexuality. And, I came away feeling like those kids do not have an adult to talk to because I think they were just really open and appreciative of the chance to be taken seriously and listened to.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They were
in
surprised
some ways,
adults wanted to hear about that.
Yeah.
They were like, what? Adults don't usually talk to us about this.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's take, we got Reyes and Dante have somewhat complementary questions. In the first case, have you had the situation where the qualitative and quantitative give you two different storylines?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I definitely have had, one study, trying to look at, and this is an intervention of socio-emotional learning intervention. We did every which way to find, some kind of effect of the intervention, and really it was very limited, which may be that, a tier 1 intervention just, it's really hard to find an answer. And the qualitative interviews with teachers, that the teachers really expressed that they got a lot out of it. They could pinpoint some of the reasons it was successful. And as Renee had said earlier, the things that they talked about weren't the outcomes we were asking about. So, that was helpful. And that happens. Sometimes the results don't complement each other exactly.
Right.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Renee. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll add to the other article that we sent out. That's a study Michelle and I did a number of years ago on gender equity is a nice example of that too, where the survey data, sort of indicate that teachers were engaging in equitable practices and see it as a fair school and all this. And then the student, what we observed in the classroom and what we learned from talking to students was kind of how we think about gender equity didn't fully capture some of the disparities in their experiences, where their boys and girls weren't describing having the same experience in the classroom and what some of that was about. So that if we had just done the survey, we would have walked away going, wow, this school is so, this is great. There's such a huge commitment. And there was in fact a huge commitment. But then why didn't we see that reflected in what the students had to say? And it was in those narratives that we got a sense of that why. So they do. You sometimes get really different stories.
And just, qualitatively being in the room with the girls versus being in the room with the boys was so different.
Completely different. Completely different, yeah.
So from my perspective, what I'm hearing you say is that in both of these cases, as a quantitative researcher, we come in with our theories and our models and our quantitative lead divines, whether it's grades or whether.
I want to thank you all for being on this conference call, and the files, the articles that Renee and Michelle mentioned, they were sent out previously, but I'll forward them to participants again as well as the recording session. So if there aren't any further questions, I'll wrap us up.
All right.
Well, thank you all for your time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.